Welcome to the Beau Show. This week will mark the beginning of a landmark trial regarding the First Amendment, when former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin seeks damages against one of the biggest journalism outlets, the New York Times. For 4.5 years, Palin has been battling the Times over an editorial that falsely linked her to a deadly mass shooting in Arizona that wounded Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. In a Manhattan federal court, Palin and her team will try to convince jurors that the Times and editor James Bennett defamed her. This trial, presided over by Judge Jed Rakoff, is a rare occurrence in which a major media company has to defend its editorial practices before a jury. For Palin, who is indeed a public figure, there is a high burden to prove clear and convincing evidence that the paper showed, quote, actual malice in the paper's writing process. You would think that it wouldn't take much, but the bigger a public figure you are, the higher the bar is. I can't see how it would be hard to prove, though, because Palin has been the brunt of many overtly liberal attacks. But when it comes from a media source, even with a known liberal bias, it's a different story. Roy Gutterman, a Syracuse law professor, argues that this case is essentially over an opinion and sets a dangerous precedent for public officials to litigate any editorial they disagree with. But where I think Gutterman is wrong is that the Times has had actual malice many times towards politicians that it disagreed with, including Donald Trump. And they've had to retract or revise many of their editorials, even after the damage was already done. They don't care to pursue the facts or truth first, they just shoot first and aim later. The editorial in question is from June 14, 2017, titled America's Lethal Politics, which linked Palin's Political Action Committee to the 2011 mass shooting in Arizona that left 6 dead and wounded Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. Palin is seeking unspecified damages, but allegedly it's around $421,000 in damages to her reputation. The Times editorial said the link to incitement was clear, especially after the editorial claimed that Palin's PAC put out a map with 20 stylized crosshairs on Democrats. These assertions and links were simply not true. This editorial was published right after the congressional softball game shooting, in which a number of congressmen, such as Steve Scalise, were wounded, having been targeted by a Bernie Sanders supporter. I don't know if that will be introduced as evidence, but isn't it highly ironic that after a Democrat shot a number of Republicans at a softball game, that the Times, rather than seeking answers about that shooter, just randomly decides to run an editorial trying to link Sarah Palin's PAC to the Gabby Giffords shooting in 2017. Wouldn't that rise to the level of actual malice? Palin objected to language that editor Bennett added to the draft of the editorial by one of his colleagues, claiming that he knew the power of his words and their intent. It was Bennett who added these false and defamatory statements in that draft. Now, the Times corrected the editorial after the fact, disclaiming any connection between the PAC and the shooting. But as we think about even January 6th and the current investigation into it, what the Times did to Palin foreshadowed that. They were attempting to create a link where none existed. Now, either that's extremely sloppy journalism or there's bias and a preconceived narrative. Both are unacceptable. The Reuters article about this story quotes Fordham law professor Benjamin Zipursky, who says that Bennett's immediate panic mode to correct the article indicates that he was unaware of a mistake, adding that even gross negligence isn't good enough to win her case. Once again, Reuters is finding these liberal law professors that seem to want to cover for the Times. Could they not find one lawyer that disagrees? I mean, if Palin was able to appeal, someone thinks she has a case. 58 years ago, the Supreme Court set precedent on this type of case in United States versus Sullivan, which makes it hard for public figures to win libel lawsuits. That case provided a standard for actual malice. 2 current Supreme Court justices, Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, have suggested revisiting that case. Palin has said that she will challenge the Sullivan precedent on appeal if she loses at trial. Reuters found a third liberal law professor, shocker, this time Don Herzog at the University of Michigan, to once again doubt Palin's chances. He said that the Times editorial was simply opinion and thus not actionable in defamation. The Times might argue that mistakes simply happen under deadline pressure, which I think is a very weak argument, but that's what their team will say. They did say the following in a January filing, quote, Governor Palin already was viewed as a controversial figure with a complicated history and reputation. And in the time since the editorial was published, Governor Palin has prospered, unquote. All right, so their argument is going to be that Palin has actually gained popularity since that time, not lost any, just due to the defamation. Obviously, they're saying it didn't happen. One of the lawyers that was consulted for the Reuters piece about this trial, Gutterman, that I mentioned earlier, said that it's unfortunate that this happened at the New York Times, but a mistake does not rise to malice. This is another liberal lawyer showing his own leftist bias. We know that publications all over this country have already been committing libel, and I'd say the most famous recent example is Nick Sandmann with his victorious lawsuits against the Washington Post and NBC. Now, we don't know the actual numbers, but they're likely big. And when I heard Kyle Rittenhouse speak not that long ago, his team is also likely pursuing a similar path, as he was 17 when all these reports came out. Now, Sandmann and Rittenhouse are not the public figures that Sarah Palin is, but juries are still awarding them and finding these media outlets to be culpable. I just don't see how the New York Times can hide behind this simply being a mistake, especially given the timing of the congressional softball shooting. The Supreme Court's precedent in 1964 is at the center of this case and what actual malice means. Donald Trump, in his most recent history tour, talked about this very thing and the idea of changing the laws to be able to sue companies for libelous coverage. Sadly, with such extreme and obvious liberal bias in newsrooms across America, the malice may be both subliminal and intentional. Not long ago, I spoke with Arizona gubernatorial candidate Kari Lake about this very thing, as she has worked as an on-camera anchor for over 20 years and saw this bias every day. Take a listen to her thoughts on this.
You and I share something in common in that we were both part of media operations where I noticed bias. I noticed that even in the copy that was being read, there was, if not misleading, entirely false. Why is this happening in newsrooms across America?
I think it's because there's no diversity of ideology. When you bring in people fresh out of journalism school, they're teaching them to be activists rather than journalists. And I believe that most newsrooms, 90% of them, are people who lean left or all the way leftists. And when you get that ideology, a lack of diversity where there's no conservatives, and the conservatives are keeping quiet because they're afraid to speak out, then that's what kind of content you get, leftist content. And that's what's happening.
The New York Times has been one of America's most durable and trusted newspapers. But over time, as Kari mentioned, bias has become the norm. Media has consolidated and become less intellectually diverse. I witnessed this myself in various media positions I've had where I could not fathom the coverage of certain stories and sat there incredulously as stories were reported as fact, but draped in opinion. Many times stories had to be retracted or shelved altogether. And I'll give you one example. When the Jussie Smollett fake hate crime happened, I did some research and I found old tweets that Jussie had posted from long ago that targeted Donald Trump. It was clear Smollett was a bona fide leftist who hated Trump, and he'd made baseless allegations targeting him. I thought to myself, could it be that his hatred was so severe that he'd be willing to stage this hate crime because he knows the political temperature right now? And who's going to question him as a victim? Targeted by two white guys in Chicago. I don't recall any outlet bringing up those tweets that gave us some context into all of this. Instead, it was reported as fact that Jussie was attacked, even though the Chicago PD was already skeptical. But Windy City politics shielded Smollett as he was an Obama friend. That kept a lot of facts from this story ever surfacing. The Times is no stranger to controversy. You may recall the 1619 Project, a long-form piece in the New York Times Magazine examining slavery in the United States by reporter Nicole Hannah-Jones. Historians wrote in to dispute her reporting, and even the magazine's own editor-in-chief called it into question. In 2003, The Times admitted that one of its reporters, Jason Blair, had committed journalistic fraud over a period of years. In 2007, The Times ran a full-page ad paid for by MoveOn.org, a George Soros-funded group, about General David Petraeus, titled General Petraeus or General Betray Us. The Times standards forbid ads that are personal attacks, but they sure let this one rip. The 2006 Duke lacrosse case also provided more internal bias on the editorial staff, as editors took a pro-prosecution stance in spite of the original reporting that was exculpatory. In February of 2008, The Times published an article on John McCain's alleged relationship with lobbyist Vicky Eisman and involvement with other special interest groups. Robert Keating, who investigated McCain during the Keating 5 scandal, found zero evidence of anything against him and had recommended to the Senate Ethics Committee at that time to not pursue it. He called this New York Times piece a smear job. Remember, this was leading up to the election of 2008 with McCain versus Obama. Just a coincidence? I'll let you decide. With Palin being McCain's running mate at the time, the Times obviously had bias against Palin all the way back then. Here's another doozy. A podcast for the Times called Caliphate has a host named Abu Huzaifa al-Kanadi, who spoke on his podcast about murdering people when he was with ISIS. In 2018, the Times published a cartoon of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin as gay lovers. In August of 2018, the Times hired columnist Sarah Jong to its editorial board. Jong had a history of racial tweets such as, quote, "Oh man, it's kind of sick how much joy I get out of being cruel to old white men," unquote, and frequently using the hashtag cancel white people. The Times stood by her and brought no disciplinary or action against Jong. The Times has affirmed it has used anti-Semitic tropes. Senator Tom Cotton's 2020 editorial during the George Floyd protest that suggested sending in National Guard troops if necessary to help quell violence and riots was rebuked by many Times reporters, calling it misinformation. It was actually defended by the editor in question in the Palin case, James Bennett. But the paper issued a statement saying Cotton's editorial did not meet their standards and was rushed. Bennett even resigned days later. Here's what Cotton said in response.
Hardly, Maria. I will say my op-ed didn't meet the Times standards. It far exceeded their standards, which is usually sophomoric left-wing drivel. But here's what happened behind the scenes. Last weekend, we saw rioting, looting, really anarchy and insurrection on our streets. In Washington, D.C., 7 days ago, a famous church was torched, memorials were desecrated, stores were looted. And I said simply last Monday that if the local police are overwhelmed by the numbers of these insurrectionists, if they need support from the National Guard, or if necessary as a last resort, federal troops under the Insurrection Act, and that's exactly what has to happen. Now, fortunately, that's what happened in most places over the course of last week. So what we saw yesterday was people exercising their First Amendment rights to demonstrate and to protest. But in the meantime, we published that exact argument in the New York Times. The New York Times editorial page editor and owner defended it in public statements, but then they totally surrendered to a woke child mob from their own newsroom that apparently gets triggered if they're presented with any opinion contrary to their own, as opposed to telling the woke children in their newsroom, this is the workplace, not a social justice seminar on campus.
This is true. Bennett and the board bowed to the tantrum of its newsroom mob who don't accept diverse opinions. In June of 2021, the very funny satire site The Babylon Bee threatened suit against the Times for calling the Bee a far-right misinformation site. The Times then removed that description, having been caught red-handed. Through all these examples that I have provided, do you see a theme emerging? They are showing bias against anyone that is conservative. They promote things like the 1619 Project, George Soros groups, and a former ISIS killer, and publish hit pieces on John McCain, Donald Trump, the Babylon Bee, and now Sarah Palin. To me, this indicates a pattern of bad judgment, where retractions are necessary, but also it shows demonstrable bias. I don't know what will be admissible in the Palin case, but it seems that she could go back a long way and show a history of bias against her dating back to the 2008 McCain campaign, especially with the knowledge that the smear piece on McCain was intentionally false. I think all of these examples provide evidence of actual malice. Rather than publishing an overt op-ed to smear Palin, they were reporting things that were demonstrably untrue, not as opinion, but as fact. Hopefully that distinction will be made so many of these examples that I mentioned, especially the Tom Cotton one. They'll give the world an insight into newsrooms and how they actually work and what goes into their decision making. In some cases, and I can attest, there's so much bias and uniformity of opinion that staffers are blind to any other viewpoint. In those situations, perhaps you could argue that there's no malice because they just don't know any better. They are brainwashed. In that case, the journalism may just be lazy or sloppy. But it also proves confirmation bias. If you hate Nick Sandmann, then you want to report the story as Sandmann being the aggressor, when the video showed that the exact opposite happened. Editors knew that the full video told the real story, but they selectively edited it. That shows actual malice to me, all to make a teenager look bad. And Bennett, the editor who resigned, might have greenlit the Tom Cotton op-ed because he knew what kind of controversy it might stir. For him to say, well, the op-ed didn't meet their editorial standards is just bogus. They know what Tom Cotton is going to say. The article was titled, "Send in the Troops." But to act like the op-ed was misinformation when he had previously defended it on free speech grounds was a complete capitulation to the Times mob. The Times quietly amending a hit piece on Sarah Palin is their way of trying to get out of a pickle. But therein lies the problem with the Sullivan case of 1968. The threshold is quite high for public figures to prove the actual malice of the libel. If the opinion section of the Times were actually balanced, you might be able to say, well, they're at least presenting both sides. But they rarely do that. They show favoritism. If the country is half conservative and half liberal, why is it that most newsrooms have a hefty lean to the left? Why is it showing up in the actual copy and not just in the opinion areas? That's the question we should be asking. When BuzzFeed News published the Steele dossier on Donald Trump without ever confirming or fact-checking the allegations, you have to wonder what is happening in media all across the country. It was terribly damaging to Trump, but turned up totally unsubstantiated. And what also happens is that when an outlet like BuzzFeed lets the cat out of the bag, other outlets, especially comedic ones like late night TV, begin spitting it out as fact. And then the rumor carries more weight than the truth. But I think that in the pattern of malfeasance that we have seen at the New York Times, there's been a noticeable bias against anyone that is conservative or Republican. For instance, do you remember the report about Democratic member of Congress Eric Swalwell working with a Chinese woman named Christine Fang, or Fang Fang as she goes by, who U.S. intelligence was investigating as a spy? You can barely find any info about that in the New York Times. In fact, the only place I could find anything about it was buried at the bottom of an article about Swalwell suing Trump over January 6th. The association with the alleged Chinese spy was barely even covered, but every other major media outlet reported on it. This is selective editing. It really is a major story, but the Times just refuses to give it credence. But they'll make a major leap of faith to the Sarah Palin story to a mass shooting. You have to ask yourself, why? Well, again, even if they felt they were doing good reporting, it was obviously wrong. But it seems more logical that they would take an event like the shooting at the congressional softball game and spin that back to Palin somehow from a position of bias and intent. I do understand why the Sullivan case matters and why we don't want lawsuits popping up over every salacious opinion editorial. After all, critical speech is protected speech. But when you see a pattern in a media outlet of abuse, of repeat bias, of repeat retractions, and it's all directed at one side of the aisle, it begins to look more like willful malice than mere lax editorial standards. I think the totality of evidence points to that. And this is true in media outlets all over the country. Now look, my show is an opinion and commentary show, but I give you facts which I then analyze and provide perspective on. What I don't do is read you falsehoods in the hope that they're true, or state them if I can't confirm their veracity. That would be dishonest. For instance, when I state that MoveOn.org paid a lot of money to the Times to attack General David Petraeus, that is verifiable on multiple sources, including the New York Times itself. But grasping at things like tying Sarah Palin's political action committee to a mass shooting and crosshairs shows that they had the means and the motive to do it. Hiding behind tight deadlines and sloppy editing is just not acceptable. The Times needs to not just accept its bias, but also address it. Or maybe just start calling themselves an entirely liberally biased opinion operation and call it a day. When I devoted a whole show to The View, Meghan McCain commented that she would suggest topic ideas that would just get shot down by producers. However, the show is called The View, which means it's all opinion. The Times is supposed to hold itself to a higher standard than that. I would expect Joy Behar to say anything imaginable about Sarah Palin to defame her. But that's Behar, and she's paid for her views. The Times is supposed to be reporting the news that matters to people, not guessing at connections to mass shootings, as if she had created incitement to violence. Technically speaking, the way the Times handled the Tom Cotton op-ed, it could be viewed as incitement, if not willful oblivion or silence, when it came to the violent riots, looting, and arson during the summer of 2020. For instance, if you report a riot that destroys a business as a peaceful protest, are you really reporting the facts? Or have you inserted yourself into the narrative and picked a side? I went to the New York Times website recently, and as I skimmed the headlines, there's an op-ed piece by noted liberal Paul Krugman entitled, quote, "Attack of the Right-Wing Thought Police," unquote. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Most of us sane, logical people know that the thought policing is entirely driven by leftism, which invaded academia and social media and even our current scientific debates. But that's what the Times wants you to read. They want you to think otherwise, that the thought policing is on the right. So where's the balance? Is there even an attempt at being fair? I know that Sarah Palin probably has a tough road with this case because of the highly antiquated Sullivan Supreme Court case. But in my opinion, she has a lot of evidence to draw from and a pattern of editorial behavior. This past Monday, Palin tested positive for COVID, so the trial has been delayed for 10 days. Judge Rakoff said, quote, "She is, of course, unvaccinated," unquote. I don't know why it was necessary for him to say that, but it seems a little prejudicial, if you know what I mean. I'm Beau, and that's the show.